Greetings. Before we start, I recommend that you subscribe to the channel and like this video. Pauline had always been a person with a clear vision and purpose in life. She had graduated from college with honors, secured a high-paying job, and married the love of her life. They had a beautiful home, traveled extensively, and had a strong support system of family and friends. But then something unexpected happened. Pauline's company downsized and she lost her job. She spent months looking for new employment, but nothing seemed to work out. The bills piled up, and she and her husband began to argue more and more. One night, after a particularly heated argument, Pauline stormed out of the house in a fit of rage. She wandered the streets for hours, crying and unsure of what to do. Eventually, she found herself under a bridge, cold and alone. She had never felt so lost and helpless in her life. As she drifted off to sleep, she wondered how everything had gone so wrong. The next morning, Pauline woke up feeling groggy and disoriented. She couldn't remember how she had ended up under the bridge, but the cold, hard concrete beneath her was a harsh reminder that she had nowhere to go. She sat up, rubbing her arms for warmth, and looked around. That's when she noticed a man walking towards her. He was tall and muscular, with a stern expression on his face. Pauline's heart raced as he approached, but he simply handed her a hot cup of coffee and a breakfast sandwich. "You look like you could use some help," he said gruffly. Pauline didn't know what to say. She had never been in this position before, and the kindness of a stranger was overwhelming. "Thank you," she managed to choke out, taking the food gratefully. "Name's Mike," the man said, holding out his hand. Pauline hesitated for a moment before shaking it tentatively. "Pauline," she replied softly. Over the next few days, Mike became Pauline's lifeline. He brought her food and blankets, and even found her a part-time job cleaning at a local diner. Pauline was grateful for the help, but couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Mike was always watching her, and she couldn't help but feel like he was waiting for something. One night, Pauline woke up to the sound of voices. She peeked out from under her blanket and saw Mike talking to another man, who she didn't recognize. They were speaking in hushed tones, and Pauline couldn't make out what they were saying. She stayed as still as possible, not wanting to draw attention to herself. That's when she heard her husband's voice. "I don't know how you found her, but thank you," he said, sounding relieved. "She's been missing for days." Pauline's heart stopped. Her husband was here, and he had been looking for her. She felt a mixture of relief and guilt wash over her. Why had she left without telling anyone? Mike and the stranger turned to face her, and Pauline panicked. She didn't want to be found, not like this. She pretended to be asleep, hoping they would leave her alone. But then she heard her husband's voice again. "Is she okay?" he asked, sounding worried. Mike leaned down and placed a hand on Pauline's shoulder. She flinched, but didn't move. "She's fine," he said, his voice low. "Just tired." Pauline heard her husband sigh in relief, and then the sound of footsteps retreating. She waited until she was sure they were gone before sitting up and staring at Mike. "Why did you do that?" Mike shrugged. "You looked like you didn't want to be found," he said. "I was just trying to help." Pauline was conflicted. On one hand, she was grateful for Mike's help. On the other, she was angry that he had kept her hidden from her husband. "I need to talk to him," she said finally. "He deserves to know where I am." Mike looked at her for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," he said. "But be careful. You don't know who's out there." Pauline nodded, and Mike helped her to her feet. She felt weak and shaky, but determined. She needed to find her husband and figure out what had gone so wrong in her life. Mike led Pauline through the winding streets, avoiding the more crowded areas and sticking to the shadows. Pauline felt like a criminal, sneaking around her own city. She wondered how her life had come to this. Finally, they arrived at a small park. Pauline's heart raced as she saw her husband sitting on a bench, his head in his hands. He looked up as they approached, and his eyes widened in surprise and relief. "Pauline," he exclaimed, standing up and rushing towards her. "Where have you been?" Pauline felt tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. She had never felt so relieved to see him. I don't know," she said, her voice trembling. "Lost, I guess." Her husband hugged her tightly, and Pauline felt like she could finally breathe again. They sat down on the bench, and Pauline told him everything that had happened. Losing her job, the arguments, the feeling of being trapped. Her husband listened intently, his face pained. "I had no idea," he said finally, taking her hand. "I'm so sorry." Pauline felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't alone anymore. They sat in silence for a few moments, just enjoying each other's company. That's when Pauline heard a rustling in the bushes. She tensed up, and her husband noticed. "What's wrong?" he asked. Pauline hesitated, unsure of whether or not to tell him about Mike. But then she saw a figure emerge from the bushes, and her heart stopped. It was the stranger from earlier, and he had a gun. Pauline's husband stood up, shielding her with his body. "Who are you?" he demanded. The stranger didn't answer, instead taking a step closer and pointing the gun at them. Pauline's heart was pounding in her chest. She had never been so scared in her life. Suddenly, Mike appeared from behind a nearby tree, a baseball bat in his hand. "Get away from them," he growled, stepping towards the stranger. The stranger hesitated for a moment, then turned and ran. Mike chased after him, disappearing into the darkness. Pauline's husband helped her to her feet, and they hugged each other tightly. "Thank God you're okay," he said. Pauline nodded, feeling numb. She couldn't believe how close she had come to losing everything. "We need to get out of here," she said finally. "I don't feel safe." Her husband nodded, and they quickly made their way out of the park and back to their apartment. They locked the door behind them and collapsed onto the couch, exhausted. "We need to leave," Pauline said, her voice shaking. "We can't stay here anymore." Her husband nodded, his face serious. "Okay," he said, "but where will we go?" Pauline thought for a moment, then remembered the card Mike had given her. "I know someone who can help," she said, pulling the card out of her pocket. Her husband looked at the card, then back at her. "Are you sure we can trust him?" Pauline hesitated, but then nodded. "He saved my life," she said. "I trust him." Her husband nodded, and they began to pack their bags. They didn't know what the future held, but they knew they couldn't stay where they were. They had to take a chance and hope for the best. They left their apartment in the early hours of the morning, trying to avoid any attention. They walked for miles, their footsteps echoing in the empty streets. The city was quiet and dark, and Pauline couldn't help but feel like they were fleeing from something. Finally, they arrived at the address on the card. It was a rundown building on the outskirts of the city, with broken windows and peeling paint. Pauline's husband looked at her skeptically. "This is the place?" he asked. Pauline nodded, feeling a twinge of doubt. What if Mike had been lying to her? What if this was all a trap? They approached the door, and Pauline knocked hesitantly. There was no answer. She knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing a dark hallway. Pauline hesitated for a moment, then stepped inside. Her husband followed closely behind. The hallway was dimly lit, with flickering bulbs overhead. The walls were covered in graffiti, and there was a musty smell in the air. Pauline felt a shiver run down her spine. "Hello," she called out. "Is anyone here?" There was no answer. They continued down the hallway, their footsteps echoing on the concrete floor. Finally, they arrived at a door. It was slightly ajar, and light was spilling out from inside. Pauline pushed it open, revealing a small room with a table in the center. There were several people sitting around the table, all of them staring at her and her husband. One of them stood up, a tall man with piercing blue eyes. He looked at Pauline for a long moment, then nodded. "I've been expecting you," he said. Pauline felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had made the right decision coming here. The man motioned for them to sit down at the table. Pauline and her husband took a seat, feeling nervous and unsure of what to expect. "My name is Jack," the man said. "Mike told me about your situation. I can help you, but you need to be honest with me. What happened?" Pauline took a deep breath, then began to recount the events of the past few days. She told him about waking up under the bridge, about the stranger with the gun, about Mike saving her life. She left nothing out, telling him everything she could remember. When she was finished, Jack sat back in his chair, his face thoughtful. "I see," he said finally. "You're in a tough spot." Pauline's husband spoke up. "What can you do to help us?" Jack leaned forward. "I have connections," he said. "I can get you new identities, new jobs, a new life. But you need to understand that this isn't going to be easy. You'll have to cut ties with everyone you know, and you'll have to be willing to start over from scratch." Pauline and her husband looked at each other. They knew what Jack was saying was true. They had no other options. "We'll do it," Pauline said finally. "Whatever it takes." Jack nodded. "Okay, I'll make the arrangements. But you need to disappear for a while. Lay low. Stay off the grid. I'll contact you when everything is ready." Pauline and her husband stood up, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe things would finally start to get better. As they left the room, Pauline couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. For the first time in a long time, she felt like there was a way out of the darkness. Over the next few days, Pauline and her husband did their best to stay hidden. They moved from place to place, never staying in one location for too long. They slept in cheap motels and ate at fast food restaurants, trying to blend in with the crowds. Finally, Jack called. "It's time," he said. "Meet me at the address I gave you, and be prepared to leave everything behind." Pauline and her husband arrived at the address, a nondescript building in a rundown part of town. Jack was waiting for them outside, holding a briefcase. "Here," he said, handing the briefcase to Pauline. "These are your new identities. Use them wisely. And remember, if anyone comes looking for you, you don't know anything." Pauline and her husband nodded, feeling a sense of finality wash over them. This was it, the beginning of a new life. As they walked away from Jack, Pauline couldn't help but feel a sense of excitement. She was starting over. Everything was going to be okay. But as they turned a corner, they saw something that made their blood run cold. There, standing on the sidewalk, was the stranger from under the bridge. He was staring right at them. Pauline and her husband froze, unsure of what to do. They had thought they were safe. They had thought they were in the clear. But as the stranger began to approach them, they knew that their troubles were far from over. The stranger was getting closer and closer, and Pauline and her husband could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. They looked around, trying to find an escape route, but there was nowhere to go. They were trapped. The stranger stopped in front of them, his eyes scanning their faces. "Hello, Pauline," he said, a smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. "I've been looking for you." Pauline's husband stepped forward, trying to block the stranger's view of her. "Who are you?" he demanded. The stranger's smirk turned into a sneer. "You don't need to know that," he said. "What you do need to know is that Pauline belongs to me. She owes me a debt, and I intend to collect." Pauline felt a sense of dread wash over her. She knew exactly what the stranger was talking about. She had made a deal with him, and now it seemed like he was going to make her pay. But she wasn't going to go down without a fight. "I don't owe you anything," she said, trying to sound confident. The stranger laughed. "You really think you can walk away from me? You're nothing without me, Pauline. You're a nobody, a homeless junkie. You need me." Pauline felt a surge of anger. She had been trying so hard to escape her past, to start over. and now this man was threatening to ruin everything. She looked at her husband, who was standing beside her, his eyes filled with determination. Together, they could fight back. Together, they could overcome anything. Pauline took a step forward, facing the stranger head-on. "I don't need you," she said firmly. "I have my husband, and we have each other. That's all we need." The stranger looked at her, a look of disgust on his face. "Fine," he spat, "but don't think you've won. I'll be watching you. And when the time is right, I'll be back." And with that, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Pauline and her husband stood there for a moment, catching their breath. They knew that the stranger was right. He would be watching them, and they would have to be ready for whatever he had in store. But for now, they had each other, and that was all that mattered. The next few weeks were a blur of activity as Pauline and her husband settled into their new lives. They had new identities, new jobs, and a new home. They were doing their best to blend in and avoid any attention. But Pauline couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time they left the house, she scanned the crowds, looking for any sign of the stranger. Her husband noticed her unease and tried to reassure her. "We're safe now," he said. "We have nothing to worry about." But Pauline knew better. She knew that the stranger was out there, somewhere, waiting for his chance to strike. And then one day, it happened. Pauline was walking home from work when she heard a familiar voice calling her name. She turned around and saw the stranger, his face twisted into a sneer. "What do you want?" Pauline demanded, her heart pounding in her chest. The stranger stepped forward, his eyes locked on hers. "I want what's mine," he said, "and I'm not leaving until I get it." Pauline knew that she was in trouble. She knew that she had to get away, but the stranger was too close, too fast. And then, just as he was about to grab her, a hand reached out and pulled her away. It was her husband. He had come to rescue her. The stranger lunged at him, but her husband was ready. He fought back with everything he had, trading blows with the stranger in the middle of the street. Pauline watched in horror as the two men battled it out. She knew that they had to get away, that they couldn't stay there any longer. She grabbed her husband's arm. "We have to go," she said, pulling him away from the fight. Together, they ran down the street, their hearts pounding in their chests. They didn't stop until they were safely back inside their home, locked away from the rest of the world. Pauline looked at her husband, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you," she said. "Thank you for saving me." Her husband pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'll always be here for you," he said, "no matter what happens." And for the first time in a long time, Pauline felt like everything was going to be okay. The incident with the stranger left Pauline and her husband shaken. They knew that they couldn't stay in their home any longer, that they had to move again, start over somewhere new. They packed their bags and hit the road, driving for hours until they reached a small town on the outskirts of the city. There, they rented a small house and settled in, hoping that this time they would be able to stay put. But even though they were in a new place, Pauline couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Every time she went outside, she felt like eyes were following her, like someone was waiting to pounce. Her husband tried to reassure her, but he was worried too. He knew that they were running out of options, that eventually they would run out of places to hide. And then one day, everything changed. Pauline was walking home from the grocery store when she saw a man standing outside her house. He was tall and thin, with dark hair and sharp features. She recognized him immediately. It was the stranger. Pauline's heart raced as she approached the man. She didn't know what he wanted, but she knew that it couldn't be good. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The stranger looked at her with a cold, emotionless gaze. "I want what's mine," he said, "and I'll stop at nothing to get it." Pauline felt a chill run down her spine. She knew that the stranger was dangerous, that he would do whatever it took to get what he wanted. But she wasn't about to give in. Not this time. She stood her ground, facing the stranger with a steely resolve. "You're not getting anything from me," she said. "Not now, not ever." The stranger sneered. "We'll see about that," he said, before turning and walking away. Pauline watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that this was only the beginning, that the stranger wouldn't give up so easily. But she was ready to fight, to protect herself and her husband, to do whatever it took to keep them safe. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Pauline and her husband tried their best to keep a low profile, to blend in with the rest of the town and avoid drawing any unwanted attention. But it seemed that the stranger was always one step ahead of them. Everywhere they went, he seemed to be watching, waiting for his moment to strike. Pauline was constantly on edge, never knowing when the stranger would show up again. She couldn't sleep at night, couldn't concentrate during the day. Her mind was consumed with fear and worry, and she felt like she was slowly losing her grip on reality. Her husband tried to be supportive, but even he was starting to crack under the pressure. He had always been a strong, confident man, but now he seemed to be shrinking before her eyes. And then, one night, everything came to a head. Pauline and her husband were sitting in their living room, watching TV and trying to relax. They had locked all the doors and windows, but they still couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Suddenly, they heard a noise outside. It sounded like someone was trying to force their way into the house. Pauline's heart raced as she grabbed a nearby lamp, ready to defend herself if necessary. Her husband picked up a heavy vase, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. And then the front door burst open, and the stranger stepped inside. Pauline swung the lamp at him with all her might, but he easily dodged the blow and tackled her to the ground. Her husband rushed forward, but the stranger knocked him back with a swift punch to the face. Pauline struggled against the stranger's grip, fighting for her life. She could feel his hot breath on her face, could smell the stench of his sweat and cigarettes. But then, something miraculous happened. The stranger suddenly recoiled, clutching his chest and gasping for breath. He stumbled backwards, crashing into a nearby table and knocking over a vase. Pauline and her husband looked on in shock as the stranger collapsed to the ground, writhing in agony. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The stranger lay motionless on the floor, his body convulsing as if in the throes of death. Pauline and her husband were stunned, unable to believe what they had just witnessed. They looked at each other, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and confusion. And then, as if on cue, a group of men burst into the room, their faces hidden behind masks and hoods. They quickly surveyed the scene, their eyes flicking back and forth between Pauline, her husband, and the stranger on the floor. And then, one of them spoke. "We're here to help you," he said, his voice calm and reassuring. "You're not safe here. You need to come with us." Pauline and her husband didn't know what to do. They were still reeling from the attack, still trying to process everything that had happened. But they knew that they couldn't stay there any longer. They had to trust these men, these strangers who had come to their aid. So they nodded their heads and allowed the men to lead them out of the house and into the night. The men led Pauline and her husband through a series of winding alleyways and back streets, always keeping to the shadows and avoiding any main roads or well-lit areas. Pauline could feel her heart racing as they walked, her mind filled with questions and fears. Who were these men? What did they want with her and her husband? And what had happened to the stranger who had attacked them? But she didn't dare ask. She knew that she had to trust these men, at least for now. After what seemed like hours, they finally arrived at a rundown building on the outskirts of town. The men led Pauline and her husband inside, where they were greeted by a small group of people huddled around a flickering campfire. The people looked up as Pauline and her husband entered, their faces filled with a mixture of curiosity and suspicion. And then, one of the men stepped forward and addressed the group. "These people need our help," he said, his voice ringing out over the crackling of the fire. They're in danger, and they need a place to stay. The group murmured in agreement, and Pauline and her husband were led to a small corner of the room where they could rest and recuperate. Over the next few days, they learned more about the group and their mission. They were part of a secret society, a group of people who had banded together to fight against the corruption and greed that had taken hold of the world. They called themselves the Resistance, and they were dedicated to the cause of justice and freedom for all. Pauline and her husband were amazed by what they heard. They had always known that something was wrong with the world, that there was a darkness lurking beneath the surface. But they had never known that there were others out there who felt the same way, who were willing to risk everything to make a change. As they got to know the members of the Resistance, Pauline and her husband began to feel a sense of belonging that they had never experienced before. They were among kindred spirits, people who understood their fears and shared their dreams. And then, one day, they received a message from the outside world. It was a coded message sent via a secure channel that only the Resistance knew about. It was short and cryptic, but it sent shivers down Pauline's spine. "Your time has come," the message read. "We need you now more than ever. Meet us at the designated location, and we will explain everything." Pauline and her husband knew that they had to go. They couldn't stay hidden forever, couldn't ignore the call to action that was ringing out across the world. So they said their goodbyes to the members of the Resistance, thanking them for everything they had done, and promising to keep fighting for the cause. And then they set off, following the directions in the coded message and praying that they were doing the right thing. The journey to the designated location was long and arduous, filled with danger and uncertainty at every turn. Pauline and her husband traveled by foot, always keeping to the shadows and avoiding any main roads or well-lit areas. They slept in abandoned buildings and scavenged for food wherever they could find it. But despite the hardships, they never wavered. They were fueled by a sense of purpose and a determination to make a difference, no matter the cost. And then, finally, they arrived at the designated location. It was a large, sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by high walls and guarded by heavily armed security personnel. Pauline and her husband waited in the shadows, watching and waiting for an opportunity to make their move. And then, finally, the moment arrived. A group of people emerged from the complex, led by a man in a suit who seemed to be in charge. Pauline and her husband recognized him immediately. He was a high-ranking official in the corrupt government, a man who had been responsible for countless atrocities and abuses of power. Without hesitation, Pauline and her husband sprang into action. They attacked the group with everything they had, fighting with all their strength and skill. The battle was intense and brutal, but Pauline and her husband refused to back down. They fought with a ferocity that surprised even them, driven by a burning desire to make a difference and change the world for the better. And then, finally, they emerged victorious. The high-ranking official lay unconscious on the ground, his followers scattered and defeated. Pauline and her husband looked at each other, breathing heavily and covered in sweat and blood. They had done it. They had made a difference. They had fought for what was right and emerged victorious. And in that moment, they knew that they would never stop fighting. They would never give up, never back down, never surrender to the forces of corruption and greed that threatened to destroy the world. For they were part of the Resistance now, and they knew that their time had come. As Pauline and her husband made their way back to their makeshift home, they couldn't help but feel a sense of elation and pride. They had taken a bold stand against corruption and oppression, and they had emerged victorious. They had shown that ordinary people could make a difference, that they could fight back against the forces of evil and win. But even as they celebrated their victory, they knew that there was still much work to be done. The corrupt government would not take kindly to their actions, and they would have to remain vigilant and ready to fight at a moment's notice. And then, as they walked through the darkened streets, they saw something that made their blood run cold. A group of men in black suits was waiting for them, blocking their path. Pauline and her husband tried to turn and run, but it was too late. The men were upon them, grabbing them roughly and dragging them away. They were taken to a dark, windowless room and thrown into a cell where they were left to rot. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Pauline and her husband were subjected to endless interrogations and tortures, but they refused to break. They clung to their belief in the cause, to their determination to make a difference, even as they suffered and endured. And then, finally, they were released. They emerged from the dark, cold cell into the bright sunlight, blinking and disoriented. They were weak and battered, but they were alive. As they made their way back to their makeshift home, they couldn't help but feel a sense of both despair and hope. They had been through hell and back, but they had survived, and they knew that they would never stop fighting, no matter the cost. Despite the trauma they had been through, Pauline and her husband tried to resume their normal lives. They knew that they couldn't let their guard down, but they also knew that they couldn't live in a constant state of fear. They returned to their jobs and to their activism, but they did so with a newfound sense of caution and awareness. And then, one night, everything changed. Pauline woke up to find herself lying on a cold concrete floor, her body aching and her mind foggy. She had no idea how she had gotten there or what had happened to her. She sat up slowly, trying to piece together her memories, and then she heard a voice. It was her husband's voice, but he was speaking in hushed tones to someone she couldn't see. Pauline's heart began to race as she realized that something was very wrong. She strained to listen, trying to make out what they were saying, but their words were muffled and indistinct. And then, suddenly, she heard her husband say something that made her blood run cold. "Is she dead?" Pauline's mind reeled. Had her husband betrayed her? Had he been working with their captors all along? She lay there, paralyzed with fear, as the voices continued to whisper in the darkness. As the voices continued to whisper, Pauline lay there, trying to make sense of what was happening. She couldn't believe that her own husband could be involved in such a betrayal. But as the moments ticked by, she realized that she had to act fast. She couldn't let them think that she was dead, or else she would be lost. Summoning all her strength, she slowly sat up, keeping her eyes closed and her breathing shallow. She hoped that they would think she was still unconscious. The voices grew closer, and Pauline could feel the presence of her husband and the stranger looming over her. And then, suddenly, she heard a loud crash. She opened her eyes to see the stranger lying unconscious on the ground, with her husband standing over him, holding a large rock. "What the hell is going on?" Pauline demanded, struggling to her feet. Her husband looked at her with a mixture of relief and guilt. "I'm sorry, Pauline. I had no choice. They were going to kill us both." Pauline stared at him, her mind reeling. She didn't know what to believe or who to trust. But in that moment, she realized that none of it mattered. What mattered was that they were still alive, and that they still had a chance to make a difference. She took her husband's hand, and they fled into the night, leaving their captors and their past behind. As they made their way through the darkened streets, they knew that they would have to be careful and vigilant. But they also knew that they had each other, and that together, they could face whatever the future held. And as the first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, they looked out over the city and felt a sense of hope and determination wash over them. For they knew that they had a long journey ahead of them, but they were ready for whatever lay ahead. Thanks for watching. Subscribe to the channel and send me your stories and they will be voiced.